That look today as the train is moving down the tracks, we're getting closer to where we're going to be tomorrow evening. We have a brief message on the Prince of Peace who has come into the world. Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22. And I want to begin reading in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, here I am, he answered. Take your son, he said, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So early in the morning, Abraham got up, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering, and set out to go to a place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the sacrificial knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, my father. And he replied, here I am, my son. Isaac said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Then the 2 of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He replied, here I am. Then he said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your only son from me. Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So he went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. So today it is said, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. Let us pray. Lord, as we look at this Old Testament account, the faith of Abraham, the substitute, Lord, of that ram caught in the thicket, Lord, speak to us your truth today about what it means to have faith in you, about how faith without works is dead, about how, Lord, you are the great provider. And we pray, Lord, if there be any here today who have not taken the step of trusting you, that they would do so. And we lift this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. You know, as you enter our house from our closed-in porch, to the immediate right is what I call our radio room. And that is where I like to listen to our CDs, and I enjoy listening to morning talk and get the morning news in that particular room. As you enter that radio room from our porch, the first piece of furniture you would see is a marble-topped chest. And this is very dear to me. I treasure it greatly because my great-aunt, Alice H. Marshall, gave that to me years ago. She and her husband had no children, thus no grandchildren, and so she gave me, or was going to leave to me, this marble-top chest. Inside, and to the left of the narrow top drawer, she wrote a note to me on an index card, and I've kept that and have not removed it. It's been there for over a quarter century. And it says this is a gift for William Roderick Caldwell to be claimed at our convenience. It happened to be at her death. I hope you will enjoy it a long time with our love, Alice H. Marshall. I've never removed that card. And I've often wondered, why did she leave the card? Because we sort of had a verbal agreement. You know, she said, I'm going to leave this to you, and I knew that. I wondered, well, why did she have to place that card in there? Then I talked with my other siblings and cousins and realized that she did the same thing, just a note. It may have been to remind herself, because she did suffer from dementia later, where these particular pieces of furniture would go, or it may be so that we could say, yes, this she left for me, and we would have something written. You know, we've been looking at God's covenant, and it's interesting. God doesn't have to have an index card. God doesn't forget his promises. And when God gives a promise, we can claim it. His word is good. And so we've been looking at the covenants of God. A few weeks ago, we looked at one covenant with King David. That would have been after this time period here in Genesis. And God made a covenant with David. And in this promise, he guaranteed that David's line would be that of a forever rule. That there would be one, that one being Jesus, the root and the branch of David, who would fulfill that promise. And if you remember on that Sunday when we looked at that covenant from 2 Samuel chapter 7, we also mentioned another earlier covenant, the Abrahamic covenant. And today I want to briefly look at this covenant, this promise that he made with Abraham. And we're going to see today how seemingly that covenant was threatened. We've been looking at foreshadowings of Jesus in the Old Testament during these weeks. And we see here in Genesis chapter 22, not long after God gave Abraham Isaac and made many promises through Isaac, that he gives a command to Abraham that seems to threaten the very promise that God had made. Abraham was asked to do something here that would seem almost barbaric, that would seem to most certainly not make sense. He was to take his own son. But God acted by providing a substitute. Now, throughout this, we're going to see Abraham's faith. And I want to go back. I wasn't intended to do that, but I want to go back. And there was a relationship between Abraham and God that was so close that he trusted God more than he trusted human reasoning. Notice what it says in verse 5 of our text in Genesis 22. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy, that is Isaac, and I will go over there to worship." And then what he says, "Then we'll come back." You see, he knew Isaac was going to come back. Now, the book of Hebrews chapter 11, the great roll call of faith, he believed in the resurrection of the dead. And so the roll call of faith says that Abraham offered his son Isaac, knowing that even if he was killed, that God would raise him. And so he had that faith. And that faith is depicted here. Even though he was doing something that didn't make sense all the time, he realized God was going to spare his son. And so we see Abraham's faith. He obeyed God when human reasoning would contradict what God said. Abraham, through this experience, saw God's heart. He saw God's faithfulness. And he saw something that he would not have seen had he not trusted in God to act. You know, there are actually three participants we're going to be looking at this morning. The two young men who began to accompany Isaac and Abraham. They went to a certain point, and as we just saw, God said, "You two men stay here, we're going to go on ahead." And so we know that Abraham and Isaac were on that mountain, but also there was a ram that was caught in the thicket. And I want to look at each of these and consider from the perspective of each of these. But first, Abraham, we see that he was without full understanding, yet undeterred. Now, we've studied God's aforementioned covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7 to David. And he promised David, he said, "Your kingdom and your house will endure before me forever." And then he goes on to promise, "Your throne will be established forever." And God fulfilled that promise. Last week we looked at Rahab, who was the great-great-grandmother of David, and how that line through Abraham was continuing, and how God provided, and how God was true to his word. Now today we're going to go back to this earlier period of time in the book of Genesis, in God's promise to Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, he said, "All the people of the earth will be blessed through you." In Genesis chapter 15, he noted that Abraham's descendants would be numerous. And all of this was going to come specifically through Isaac. Through Isaac. Now, when this promise was made, Isaac at first, when the promise was made, had not even been born. And so Abraham was saying, okay, this is going to be filled through Eliezer, the son of a servant. And God said no. Then we know that sort of Sarah and Abraham took matters in their own hands, and Ishmael was born through Hagar, and Ishmael was not the child of promise. And we're looking at Genesis 22. I want you to look back one chapter in Genesis chapter 21 and verse 12. But God said to Abraham, don't be concerned about the boy, that is Ishmael, and your slave, that is Hagar. Whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her. Notice what it says, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. And so we see a specific promise. All of this promise, this covenant that is given to Abraham is through Isaac. Now we have a major problem here in Genesis 22. Because were Isaac to be sacrificed at this time, he would have no descendant. There's no record that he had children. In fact, he had not had children at this point. And so the promise could not have been fulfilled had Isaac died fatherless. Yet God was calling Abraham to do something that did not make sense, humanly speaking. In fact, verse 1 said, of chapter 22, that God tested Abraham. We need to stop right there. God doesn't tempt anyone. Temptation leads to wrong action. And people are tempted, and we are tempted. I am tempted. You are tempted everywhere to do wrong. In fact, we're living in a day today where it will tell us to do wrong, to abandon a marriage, to cheat on this particular thing, to cut corners on things. That is temptation. The Bible tells us God doesn't tempt us, but God does test us. Whereas temptation brings out bad, a test brings out something good. Now, I'm not a school teacher, but when school teachers give a test, the desire of that test is that the students show that they've apprehended what has been given to them. No teacher gives a test wanting to see someone fail. A test is used to measure accomplishment, not measure failure. And so whenever God tests us, it's for our good. Sometimes we go through situations that he specifically puts us in as a test. Sometimes we go through tests in our life that really we've not brought on ourselves, but God puts us in that situation. I want you to see that Abraham passed that test. He took his promised son. He prepared the things needed to offer him. He went to the place. He even prepared the altar, even to the point of raising his hand, willing to sacrifice his son. And God provided a substitute. I wonder today, can you pass the test of faith in your life? You see, our faith is to be accompanied by actions. Look at James chapter 2, and I think it's important that we go there. I was sharing, I think, with John earlier this week. Last week we looked at Rahab. This week we're looking at Abraham. And then this week I was reading in James 2, and both of them are described in the same context as individuals who had faith in God and demonstrated that faith by doing something. Actually doing something, not sitting there, not just saying I agree, but actually putting that faith to action. Look at James chapter 2 and verse 20. Foolish man, are you willing to learn that faith without works is useless? Now notice the illustration, verse 21. Wasn't Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was active with his works, and by works faith was perfected. So the scripture was fulfilled. It says Abraham believed God and was credited to him for righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Now we need to be careful here. Man is saved by faith, but faith that is not accompanied by works is not true faith. And what we see is Abraham believed, and his belief led him to act by obeying God. Now, verse 24, or verse 25, and in the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by a different route. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. And so as we look at it, we see that there's a string tied between faith and works. I always told you I always wanted to be a basketball coach. God didn't have me do that. But when I worked with young kids and tried to teach them how to jump correctly on a layup, I said you need to tie a string between your right leg and your right arm. As your right arm goes up, and inevitably you'll show up and the kid will first come and they'll go like that. And I said, no, you've got to tie a string, right arm to right leg. When one goes up, it gives you more burst. And so we would look like a lot of fools out there. The kids would be going around like this, and the other coaches are shooting ball. And they said, what in the world are these guys doing? This doesn't make sense. There's a string between faith and works. If you have faith in God, you're going to act on it. They're tied together. When I say I have faith in God, what evidence is there that I have faith in God? The evidence is through the Word. Abraham believed God better than he believed human reasoning, and guess what? He acted on it. He was willing to do, and God showed him things. Now, there are two initial actions every person must do to express faith in Jesus. One is publicly profess Him as Lord and Savior. You see, that is an action. You say, I believe, but I'm not going to tell anyone. Well, if you truly believe, you're going to profess Him. Now, there's another thing. We're speaking initially here that if I have faith in God, I'm going to follow Him in believer's baptism. I'm not going to be ashamed of Him. I'll go through an act of baptism to demonstrate the internal faith that I have. And so we see that Abraham, even though he did not understand, he was undeterred. He acted in faith. But I want you to see Isaac. He was yielded to his father's will, yet he was rescued. There's some question and debate concerning how old Isaac was here. A lot of times we think he was young. It's very interesting that as they made their way up that mountain, Mount Moriah, where the temple would be in the future, that actually the wood was placed on his back, sort of a picture of Christ who had to carry his cross up to Golgotha. In all likelihood, this was not a young child, Isaac, at this time. Some people say he may well have been as old as 20 years of age when this happened. Imagine what was going through Isaac's mind as this event was progressing. The two guys were left behind. They're going up. He looks around. Here's the wood. Here's everything. The altar's being prepared. But where is the sacrifice? Could you imagine as his father was tying him down to the altar and his father's arms were lifted, he probably said, what in the world is going on? And then God acted in response to Abraham's act of faith. And he provided a substitute. It sort of reminds me in the New Testament, Jesus. You remember Pilate was wanting to release Jesus. And there was a custom, there was a loophole where he might be able to release this one Jesus who really in his heart of hearts realized he had done nothing wrong. And so he tried to through this Jewish custom, provide Jesus as the one who could be spared. But you remember the people yelled, no, we don't want Jesus to be spared as a result of this tradition, as a result of this thing. We want Barabbas, and so they yelled, Barabbas, Barabbas. Can you picture Barabbas getting ready to die? And all of a sudden the crowd yells, free him, let Jesus be the one to take his place. And then Barabbas observing as Jesus was being led to be crucified. You see, the altar that was prepared for Isaac here in a foreshadowing of Jesus' death for us. It was provided for Isaac, but it was filled and carried out by the ram. God acted to free Isaac, and he did so by providing a substitute. The one who did not spare his own son spared Abraham's son. You know, there's no mention of how Isaac responded after this. He probably had his heart jumping out of his throat. He probably had a lot of questions. I don't think it's a stretch to believe that Isaac had a sigh of relief as he saw that ram caught in the thicket, and it began to make sense. God has provided a substitute. But I believe that Isaac's faith was strengthened by his own father's faith here. What do you think he believed about his father when he left that mountain? He said, my father believed God. There was a song in the 60s. Again, Bob is sharing about Mel Torme. I'm sharing about songs from, I guess, maybe the 70s, Cats in the Cradle. Maybe you remember that song. I think a guy named Harry Chapin wrote it. It was one of the saddest songs. It was a song about a father whose son looked up to him, and the father was always too busy for the son. And there wasn't enough love, and there wasn't enough time. And all the time the son says, I'm going to be like him. Yeah, Dad, I'm just going to be like you. And then as the son got older, he was too busy for the father. He didn't have enough love for the father. He actually lived out what he saw, acted out before him. He never heard his father really say he loved him or that his father would take time with him. But I thought about that in light of this text today. How much faith do our children see? You see, that song spoke about a lack of time, a lack of love, but what about a lack of faith? As parents, we need to demonstrate our faith. As grandparents, we need to demonstrate our faith in God through our actions. That is, our children, as our grandchildren look at us, they can say, my dad, my mom, my grandma, my grandfather, they believe in God, and let me tell you how. I saw this. And so when Isaac left that mountain, there was no doubt in his mind that his father believed in God. But then there's a third participant I want to look at before we close, and that is the ram. The ram was in close proximity. You ever thought about that? The ram would have done no good for them had the ram been where the two men were who were left behind. The ram had to be in close proximity. Here's Abraham. He believes God can raise my son even if I do it. He's already told the two, we're going to come back down. And so Abraham's mind, even as he's obeying God, his mind is not keeping him from acting, but I'm sure his mind is saying, what's God going to do? And then he looks over, he hears the noise. He sees the ram caught in the thicket, and he says, aha, this is the answer. God has provided the substitute. Here we see, along with our theme, a foreshadowing, a picture of one who would be a substitute for another. A picture beforehand of Jesus. Remember, we've been looking at this foreshadowing. Fore means beforehand. Shadow is not the substance, but it points to the substance. And that's exactly what this ram was doing. This ram is a picture of what Jesus is to you and to me. Ready to sacrifice his son, Abraham looks up and sees this ram. And he knew it to be God's provision. Close proximity. In order to die for our sins, to be your substitute, Jesus came in close proximity. God Emmanuel, God with us. He came to this earth in order to die for us. Before we close, I want to look at one other Old Testament passage. There are 4 verses I want to look at in Isaiah chapter 53. And briefly look at these. And then we'll look at the challenge from the Word of God as we close. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 4. This passage is popularly known as the suffering servant chapter of the Bible. And it's a picture, again, some 700 plus years before Jesus came through the prophet Isaiah. This prophecy in Isaiah 53 verse 4 says, yet he himself bore our sicknesses. He carried our pains, but we in turn regarded him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. He was pierced because of our transgressions. He was our substitute. He was crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment for our peace was on him, and we are healed by his wounds. We all went astray like sheep. We've all turned our own way, and the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Notice what it says, like a lamb led to the slaughter. like a sheep silent before her shepherd. I want just to look at a few points in these verses. First, a male would be given as a sacrifice. It says he himself bore a male. We're living in a day today of gender confusion. Everybody's trying to say, well, this or that. Hey, for God, a man was a man and a woman was a woman. And clearly it said here, God distinguishes between the two genders, that a male would be offered. Here in Genesis chapter 22, a ram, a male, was offered. And so as a foreshadowing, and in Isaiah as a direct prophecy, there would be a man who would come as a sacrifice. But I want you to see that this one who would come went to his death silently. There's no mention of the ram. The ram was there. He was to fulfill that task of the substitute. Here in Isaiah it says, as a lamb is led to the slaughter quietly. The scripture says that Jesus went without resistance, that he went silently. Our greater deliverer went to his death willingly. But notice also it tells us in Isaiah 53, and as we see in this foreshadowing in Genesis 22 that we're looking at today, that this substitute would bear upon itself, in Isaiah 53, upon himself, the punishment intended for another. For this ram, it was Isaac. He was to take upon himself the sacrifice that Isaac was to fulfill for us. Jesus fulfilled that. He took upon himself our sins. In both of these, we see Jesus. We close out this morning. God is a God of order. He ordered this creation. And he did it in a very specific way. He worked 6 days and rested on the seventh. Every day there's an order to it. There's an order. This earth rotates on its axis just according to God's plan. This earth revolves around the sun during the year just according to God's plan. Intricate detail. God also is ordering our salvation. There's only one way we'll be saved, and that is through the person of Jesus Christ. Before the foundation of the world, Revelation 13:8 tells us that it was ordained that Jesus would die for us. The prophets have foretold, as we've been looking over these weeks leading up to Christmas, that it was going to happen, and it happened just in an orderly way, as Jesus said. The foreshadowings, these events that depict what we see would come later in Jesus' death on the cross, all of these have been fulfilled. And Galatians 4:4 says that he came at just the right time. And as Bob said earlier before he said, about 3 months we're going to be celebrating his death, his burial, his resurrection, and his coming again. There's an order to it. Death, burial, resurrection, second coming. And when he comes again, he's coming not quietly and humbly as he did in his first coming, but he's coming with every eye that's seen. I wonder today, have you trusted him? Have you trusted him? Do you believe in him? Do you believe in his word? He is faithful. Abraham knew God so well that even when it didn't all make sense, he obeyed what God said. Would you do that today? Maybe today your response is to publicly profess Jesus Christ as Lord. To stand here and say, I'm a follower of Christ. It might be that you believed in your heart but never taken the step of following him in believer's baptism and act just as Abraham acted just last week, as Rahab acted, doing something with your faith, that string tied to your faith, saying, I believe, and yes, this is what I'm doing to communicate that faith. Maybe God today is calling you to do something that doesn't make sense. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and do something crazy, because Abraham wasn't crazy. Abraham knew God. He just did what God told him to do. Don't go out and do something crazy in your own mind. Learn to listen to God. And if God speaks, know his heart. Maybe God's calling you to do something that may not be easy. But however God leads, obey, act accordingly. Let's pray. Father, we thank you today